Welcome. Let us discuss moral failure within moral trauma. The problem is not moral failure, but moral multiplicity. Moral injury discourse often focuses on moments of rupture, clear violations, traumatic events, or catastrophic moral collapse. A different but equally important phenomenon precedes these moments: moral ambivalence. The central claim I want to advance is this: moral distress in military life does not arise primarily from knowing what is right and being unable to do it. It often arises from knowing that more than one morally legitimate demand is simultaneously in play. The military context exposes individuals to competing moral goods, not simply moral transgressions. The uniform as moral compression. The uniform symbolizes more than authority or role. It represents moral compression. When a person puts on the uniform, multiple moral identities are compressed into a single functional role: moral agent, soldier, citizen. Subordinate, protector, potential instrument of harm. The problem is not that personal morality disappears under the uniform. The problem is that it must coexist with institutional morality, operational necessity, and obedience structures. Moral ambivalence emerges when these layers cannot be harmonized. Moral ambivalence as a normal condition. Moral ambivalence should not be treated as weakness or indecision. It is a sign of moral complexity awareness. Examples of morally ambivalent situations include loyalty to comrades versus protection of civilians, obedience to orders versus personal conscience, mission success versus proportional harm, emotional detachment versus human compassion. In each case, the distress arises not because one option is clearly immoral, but because both options carry moral weight. This reframes moral distress as a byproduct of moral seriousness, not moral confusion. Moral distress without moral transgression. A crucial distinction must be made between moral injury linked to perceived wrongdoing, moral distress linked to moral constraint. Moral distress occurs when a person believes a morally preferable action exists. Structural, hierarchical, or situational constraints prevent it. The individual remains morally aware throughout. In these cases, the injury is not guilt for wrongdoing, but sorrow over moral impossibility. This is ethically significant. No amount of ethical training can eliminate moral distress when moral conflicts are real and irreducible. The hidden danger: moral silencing. One of the most corrosive aspects of military culture is not violence itself, but moral silencing. Moral silencing occurs when ambivalence is treated as weakness, doubt is equated with disloyalty, emotional response is framed as lack of discipline. Under these conditions, individuals learn to suppress moral language altogether. The result is not resilience, but moral isolation, a condition that dramatically increases the risk of later moral injury. Moral distress as a precursor to moral injury. From this perspective, moral injury rarely appears suddenly. It is often preceded by unacknowledged moral ambivalence, accumulated moral distress, prolonged moral silence. When individuals are repeatedly required to act while internally divided, the moral self becomes fragmented. Eventually, a single event may crystallize this fragmentation into moral injury, but the groundwork has already been laid, recentering the person underneath the uniform. The phrase "the person underneath the uniform" should not be understood sentimentally. It names a structural truth. Institutions act, but persons suffer. The uniform does not absorb moral residue. The individual carries it home. Ignoring this reality leads to systems that manage performance effectively, while offloading moral cost onto individuals. A new ethical claim: moral ambivalence requires moral hospitality. If moral ambivalence is inevitable, the ethical task is not to eliminate it, but to create moral hospitality. Moral hospitality involves spaces where ambivalence can be spoken without penalty. Leaders trained to recognize moral distress, not just misconduct, chaplaincy, ethics, and mental health working collaboratively. A cultural shift from moral certainty to moral humility. This is not about weakening military effectiveness. It is about preventing moral fragmentation that ultimately undermines both individuals and institutions. Implications for ethics, leadership, and care. From this new view, several implications follow. Ethical training should include ambivalence, not just rules. Leadership should normalize moral tension, not pathologize it. Moral distress should be treated as signal, not noise. Early moral dialogue is preventative care, not indulgence. Failing to address moral ambivalence does not preserve discipline. It simply defers moral reckoning until it becomes injury. Concluding perspective. Moral life in the military is not a matter of clean choices between right and wrong. It is a life lived amid tragic dilemmas, constrained agency, and overlapping moral claims. Moral ambivalence is not a flaw in character, it is evidence of moral depth. The ethical failure occurs not when individuals experience moral conflict, but when institutions refuse to make room for the human cost of carrying it. If we want to prevent moral injury, we must begin by listening to moral distress, especially when it has no easy solution.